followers. They try to support goodness and dispel evil through knowledge. And remember the poetry part? And then it is all blended with Roman influences, which shows itself in a December feast with gaiety and presents. In the 17th century, Dutchmen emigrated to Northern America and brought their traditions of Santa Claus with it. In the New English-speaking world, the name changed to Santa Claus. In 1930, a designer for the Coca-Cola Company was asked to draw attractive advertisements because the drink did not sell well in wintertime. He had to use the company colors red and white and create some kind of cozy type. He remembered the Dutch Santa Claus, with his white dress, red cloak, long white beard, kindness, and benevolence. The 8-legged horse was replaced for 8 flying reindeer. A punishing blackjack was inappropriate for this concept, so he disappeared. The helpers became elves. So many do not know that the famous Santa Claus hat is actually the hat of Mithra. Much of the rest stayed the same. This new Santa Claus, or God of Odin, became a big hit. He became so popular that right now in Europe he is serious competition for the Santa Claus. Okay, on to the Christmas tree and the wreath. Wreaths are circular, and so in sun god tradition, they represent the female sexual organs. Wreaths are also associated with fertility and the circle of life. Wreaths are associated also with Ishtar, Semiramis, and also known as the Queen of Heaven. The counterpart male version of the wreath is actually the decorated Christmas tree. A Christmas tree decorated with spheres are to represent the complete phallic symbol of Nimrod. A sun god starburst at the top represents the sun god origins and is a tribute to the sun god deities. Various tree worship existed in Egypt and other sun god cultures. It was passed on to different nations, and the sun god traditions embedded in Germany eventually passed this tradition on to the United States. The name Easter. Worship was always associated with the worship of Baal, or sun worship. Astarte was Baal's wife. Another name for Astarte was Ashtaroth. Easter is nothing else than Astarte, one of the titles of Beltis, the Queen of Heaven. Now the Assyrian goddess, or Astarte, is identified by Semiramis by Athenagoras, also known as Semiramis as Queen of Babylon, later known as the name Ashtart, for that simply means the woman that made the towers. Ashtoreth, then, is obviously the same as the Hebrew Ashtoreth. Notice this conclusive quote from Microsoft Encarta Multimedia Encyclopedia. Ishtar was the Great Mother, the goddess of fertility, and the Queen of Heaven. So in actuality, Ashtaroth, Ishtar, was Nimrod's harlotress, mother-wife-widow, Semiramis, as many other ancient historians attest. Easter is now established as none other than Ashtaroth of the Bible. We can now examine the scriptures to show how God views the worship of this pagan goddess, by any name. Judges chapter 2. And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and they forsook the Lord and served Baal and Ashtaroth. 1 Samuel 7. Put away the strange gods and Ashtaroth from among you, and prepare your hearts unto the Lord, and serve him only. Then the children of Israel did put away Baalim and Ashtaroth, and served the Lord only. So perhaps you're familiar with the tradition of new Easter clothing. Where did that come from? Everyone knows that Easter is the day that everyone has to wear their new Easter clothing. This mentality stems from the pagan tradition that it is unlucky not to wear some sort of new clothing or personal adornment, because it symbolically signified the end of the old and the beginning of the new. Perhaps you've heard of hot cross buns. The history of the hot cross buns goes back to the Babylonian Queen of Heaven, Astarte, Ishtar, or Easter, and a reference to it is made in Jeremiah 7, which talks about making cakes to the Queen of Heaven. The Hebrew word for cakes is kavan, and is properly translated as buns. In Athens, about 1500 years before Christ, these buns, or sacred bread, were used in the worship of the goddess. They were called bon. Egyptian-made buns inscribed with 2 horns in the honor of the moon goddess, and the Greeks changed it to a cross, which fits the sign of Tammuz. The Anglo-Saxons made buns with a cross on them in honor of the goddess of light. Notice how in one of the pictures, they are included with eggs, another fertility symbol of sun god worshippers. Today, these same buns are made in respect to the sun goddess Easter, the Queen of Heaven. Carnival and Mardi Gras. In the traditional Christian calendar, it is a period of feasting and merrymaking immediately preceding Lent. Within Europe, traditions and customs are especially strong in rural areas, where magical rites carried over from pre-Christian times mingle comfortably with Christian ritual and precept. Carnival simply means doing without meat, and as a Christianized observance, is supposed to remind people of Christ's fasting in the wilderness for 40 days, the time of Lent. However, consider this article by the Houston Chronicle. Actually, there was a pagan festival in ancient Rome, one called Carne Levamen, which means taking away the flesh. Pagans believed the best way to give up flesh, or meat, was by filling up on it big time first. before the sundial brought on abstinence. In world Europe, several of the main features that have endured in the carnival celebrations are, number 1, dramatizations symbolizing the death of winter and the resurrection of life in the spring. Number 2, customs and rites to ensure fertility and the abundance in man and nature. Number 3, rich food, drink, and merrymaking. The temporary suspension or inversion of social roles, rank, and superiority. Encyclopedia Americana. Shrove Tuesday is well known as Mardi Gras in the United States. The French word Mardi Gras actually means Fat Tuesday. This was the day that everyone gorged themselves on all their rich foods. They did this before the Lenten fasting. The sunrise service. This, too, was an aspect of old pagan customs associated with sun worship. Though the custom no longer directly and intentionally celebrates the rising of the sun among Christians, God does condemn the type of service from which it was derived. Many years after Christ's death, the Catholic Church began to associate the tradition with Christ's supposed early morning resurrection in an apparent effort to compromise with their new converts' previously held religious traditions. The Catholic Church's efforts to justify are clearly misguided, because when the ladies came to Christ's tomb early Sunday morning, he already wasn't there. The Jews, during the time of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, had blended sun worship with the worship of God, as we can clearly see in scriptural references in regard to the Queen of Heaven. Ezekiel chapter 8 talks about men standing with their backs to the temple of God, facing the east and worshiping the sun. Albert Pike once wrote that all pagan religions worship the sun. Whether they knew it or not, they were actually worshiping Satan, the adversary. The temple of Yahweh faced the east, so that when they worshiped God, they would be turning away from the rising sun in the east. The sunrise service actually stems from the pagan rite of spring that was held during the vernal equinox to welcome the coming sun. According to pagan tradition, when the sun would rise on Easter morning, it would dance in the heavens, so those who would congregate would dance in honor of the sun. The assembly of Sunday is a derivative of Sun God Day. Sun God worshippers were meeting on the day after the Sabbath for ages. Constantine made it so that Christians who assembled on Sunday instead of the Sabbath. For more on this, please see our teaching titled, The Sabbath Day. If you wish to know what day our Creator declared to be His and set apart versus the day that sun god worshippers declared to be theirs and set apart. Easter ham. The pig was sacred to the Greek goddess Demeter, the corn goddess, who represented fertility and abundance, and is another counterpart of Astarte. In various depictions of her, she is either shown carrying or being accompanied by a pig. So pigs were often sacrificed to her, and it was believed that by eating a pig, it represented and embodied their goddess. They were in fact eating of her body. The prophet Isaiah warned of this in Isaiah 65. Another source says that the pig represents the wild boar that killed Tammuz, and eating ham was done in remembrance of him. Also, the tradition of the Easter ham evolved from the English tradition of eating unclean to show their resentment and contempt for the Jewish custom of not eating pork. On to the Easter bunny. The Easter bunny is a pagan symbol of fertility and new life. Bede, the 8th century English monk and scholar, related that the Teutonic goddess of spring and fertility, Estré, had the hare as her symbol. The American Book of Days. To begin with, it is actually the hare and not the rabbit which is Easter's main character, because according to ancient tradition, the hare was a symbolic representation for the moon, since they only came out at night. Also, the Egyptian name for the hare was Un, which means open, because they are born with their eyes open, while rabbits are not. Legend has it that the hare never blinks or closes its eyes. To some pagan cultures, the moon was the open-eyed watcher of the skies. The hare is associated with the goddess Ishtar, and was a symbol of fertility because they reproduced so quickly. There's also a pagan tradition concerning a bird who wanted to be a rabbit, so the goddess Oestre turned the bird into a rabbit who could still lay eggs. Every spring, during the festival dedicated to Oestre, the rabbit laid beautiful colored eggs for the goddess. This tradition is exemplified in the Cadbury television commercial for the filled chocolate eggs. Another tradition, which has been passed down, comes from Germany. According to the legend, during a time of famine, a poor woman dyed some eggs and hid them in a nest as Easter presents for her children. When the children found the nest, a big rabbit leaped away, which led to the story that a rabbit brought the eggs. The Easter rabbit lays the eggs, for which reason they are hidden in a nest or in the garden. The rabbit is also a pagan symbol and has always been an emblem of fertility. Simrock Mythology, Catholic Encyclopedia. The image of a bunny is a very well-known ancient symbol of fertility, derived from the bare-breasted goddess Ishtar, or also known as Easter. This is why the bunny logo was chosen as a fitting symbol for an unfortunately popular U.S. organization. So what about Easter eggs? Eggs are a sacred symbol of rebirth and fertility among the Babylonians, Druids, Egyptians, and other pagan cultures. Dyed eggs were used as sacred offerings during the pagan Easter season and were also used as symbols of the goddess Ishtar in various cultures. Encyclopedia Britannica. During the rule of Caesar Augustus, Hyginus, an Egyptian who was a librarian at the Palatine Library in Rome, wrote, "An egg of the wondrous sight is said to have fallen from the heaven into the river Euphrates. The fishes rolled it to the bank, where the doves, having settled upon it and hatched it, out came Venus, who afterwards was called the Syrian goddess Astarte." Part of their worship to this goddess was the ritual involving the golden egg of Astarte. This is where we receive the tradition of the Easter egg. Now on to obelisks. An obelisk is a monolithic stone monument whose four sides, which generally carry inscriptions, gently taper into a pyramidion at the top. The ancient Egyptians usually erected them in pairs and associated them with the rays of the sun, which increase in width as they reach the earth. So popular were these monuments among the Roman emperors that 13 of them were taken to Rome. These monuments are centered around Baal worship and are traditionally representative of Nimrod's sex organ. Today, in Christianity, these monuments intentionally moved from Egypt to Rome and then actually as steeples on tops of churches. Though many have done it anyway, Yahweh did not like the stone pillars that the sun god worshippers put up. Deuteronomy chapter 16. And you shall not set up a pillar which Yahweh your God hates. And finally, child sacrifice. This is one of the most disturbing practices of the sun god worship. This horrible practice associated with the worship of the fire sun god Nimrod, Saturn, Kronos, Molech, and Baal. Nimrod, as a representative of the devouring fire to which human victims, and especially children, were offered in sacrifice, was regarded as the great child devourer. He was, of course, the actual father of all the Babylonian gods, and therefore, in that character, he was afterwards universally regarded. As the representative of Molech or Baal, infants were the most acceptable offerings at his altar. We have ample and depressing evidence on this subject from the records of antiquity. The Phoenicians, says Eusebius, every year sacrificed their beloved and only begotten children to Kronos or Saturn. But why was human sacrifice such a key to the worship of this terrible god? What possible good could human beings think that they saw in slaughtering their own children? He who approached the fire would receive a light from divinity, and through divine fire, all the stains produced by generations could be purged away. Therefore, children were made to pass through the fire unto Molech. Jeremiah chapter 32. Sadly, there are legends that this is precisely why eggs are usually dyed only red in most cultures around the world. In the cultic pagan sun god temple worship, prostitution was clearly a common practice. This is why in the Bible that prostitution is often mentioned in context with other cultic temple practices, such as drinking blood, eating of meat sacrificed to idols, and other such practices of idolatry. Tradition has it that the priest would impregnate prostitutes in the spring, and then following spring they would sacrifice the children, and then burn them. The red eggs are a symbol of this fertility and the sacrifice of the children. This is expressly why Yahweh hates sun god traditions, because every tradition of a false god reminds him of the sacrificed children. He implores us not to worship him in their way, because it reminds him of the children offered to the fire. Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 30 through 31. Take care that you not be ensnared to follow after them, after they have been destroyed before you, and that you do not inquire about their gods, saying, how did these nations serve their gods? That I may also do the same. You shall not worship Yahweh your God in their way. For every abominable thing that Yahweh hates, they have done to their gods, for they even burn their sons and daughters in the fire to their gods. When Yahweh sees a Christmas tree, he sees sacrificed children to sun gods. When Yahweh sees Easter eggs, he sees sacrificed children to sun gods. When Yahweh sees any tradition derived from sun gods, and then we do the same and offer it up to him in worship of him, he only sees every abominable thing that was done for the sun gods instead. But we do not have to celebrate the days of Christmas and Easter. We can leave all those traditions behind. As emotional as that might be for now, imagine how Yahweh feels about these days and where they came from. Fortunately, Yahweh has a much better solution, his feasts. By losing the sun god's saturated days of Christmas and Easter, Yahweh offers us his days, which are found in Leviticus 23. These are the real days that eternally represent the real Messiah, Yeshua. In the spring, we have the week-long appointed time of unleavened bread. During this time, we also have the Feast of Unleavened Bread, where we can eat of the Passover, and we have first fruits, which is the real day on the real calendar that the Messiah was resurrected. Then a little later, we have Shavuot, also known as Pentecost. In the fall, we have the Day of Trumpets, known as Yom Teruah. 10 days later, we have the Day of Atonement, also known as Yom Kippur. And finally, we have the Feast of Tabernacles, also known as Sukkot. This feast lasts for 7 days and has a bonus 8th day added on at the end. Scholarly research has shown, based on biblical evidence around the revealed timing of the birth of John the Baptist, that we can calculate the timing of the birth of Yeshua. As it turns out, and it should be of no surprise, that Yeshua was actually born on one of God's appointed times, the Feast of Sukkot, and then circumcised on the 8th day of Sukkot, painting a glorious picture that only God himself could take credit for. So if you really want to celebrate the birth of Messiah, then read up on God's feast, his days that he gave to us to bless us. In fact, it is during the Feast of Sukkot that we're actually commanded to be joyful. Sometimes many find them confused, thinking that they are Jewish feasts, but our Creator, he calls them his feasts. Leviticus 23. Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, these are the appointed feasts of Yahweh, that you shall proclaim as holy convocations. They are my appointed feasts. He gave us these days to draw us closer to him and to each other in love and fellowship. The days also have real meaning embedded in them, to teach us about what our Messiah has done and still has left to do in matters of prophecy. Whereas Christmas and Easter are not from God, and any Christian symbolism is completely fabricated by man and is actually derived from sun-god traditions. Once you begin participating in something that is real, something that is really worshiping Yahweh in spirit and in truth, you will then begin to experience something that has been intended for his people since the beginning, something we unfortunately lost because the influences Yahweh despises. We realize that this has been a long teaching, and we appreciate the time you've invested in considering this material. The reality is that there is so much more, but hopefully, at minimum, this pointed you in the right direction, feeling a desire to love God with all of your heart, soul, and mind on the path that he wants for all of us. We hope that this teaching has blessed you, and remember, continue to test everything. Shalom.